Hi, this is Real World Audio, and we are taking another crack at loudspeaker impedance specifications. And I know I talked a lot about this, but today I'm going to show a different side of that. And I'm going to do this because I read this question posted on the Audiogon discussion forum that 4 ohm and 8 ohm speakers are a myth. Just look at the impedance curves on stereophile. Some go from 2 to 20 and beyond. So the second part, I'm not going to look at it because it would make things much more complicated and way too long, and I would get complaints. So now let's have a look at it. And yes, this is what we see here. Basically from 2 ohms to beyond 20 ohms. Look at that. The figure is just cut at 20 ohms. The curve would go higher than that. Maybe 25 ohm, maybe 30 ohm, 35, who knows? We don't know. We don't see that information. It's missing from here. However, what is very much evident that we see everything from the range of practically 2 ohms to 20 plus ohm. So the poster there on Audiogon forum is completely right to be confused of what on earth is going on and what gives the right to loudspeaker companies to call their loudspeakers any impedance while we see fluctuations from 2 to 20. So technically they could call this anything, right? And because if anything would fit, and yet at the same time nothing fits because it's a 2 to 30 ohm loudspeaker. Really, that's what it is. So now let's have a look on why they created this nomenclature that a loudspeaker is some a specific ohm rated, and why it doesn't work anymore. And there's a very simple explanation of that. As you see, basically the impedance shows that at different frequencies, if you pick any frequency, let's say you pick 1 kilohertz, then it's about 5 ohms impedance, right? So basically that means that when there's a 1 kilohertz sound, then the speaker behaves as if it would be 5 ohm loudspeaker. Now, if we do the same thing at, let's say, 120 hertz, it's like 5.5 ohms. So then in that case, it is a loudspeaker that's half of that impedance. Now, if you look at 2-3 kilohertz, 2.5 kilohertz, then it's like almost 14 ohms. So now what's the truth? Is it like 2.5 ohms, 5, or 3 times that? And then here it's twice that. So we are jumping all over the board. So now let's see what the company tells about us. So the Bauer-Wilkins 804D4, because this was the figure for Bauer-Wilkins 804D4, impedance is specified as 8 ohms with a minimum value of 3 ohms. Now we are on Stereophile's website looking at Stereophile's analysis. And so what does this mean? So this is supposedly an 8 ohm loudspeaker with a minimum value of 3 ohms. Is it so? Is it an 8 ohm loudspeaker? No. We see everything from basically 30 ohms to 2 ohms. So what gives them the right to call it 8 ohms? And I would say absolutely nothing, because the way the nomenclature works is that you look for the impedance minimum, and that's basically the basis for the calculations to tell you what is the impedance of the loudspeaker, because the impedance of the loudspeaker is not something constant which is independent of frequencies, because as you see, depending on the frequency, it widely fluctuates. The reason why there is a nominal impedance, which is calculated from the value is basically 80% of the nominal impedance. So the nominal impedance is the value created to give you this area. So basically the nominal impedance will give you this value, and that value is what where this loudspeaker is the hardest to drive. So the nominal impedance will tell you exactly that how heavy your loudspeaker is to drive. That's what it is. It's like a specification. So when a company defines that it's a 2 ohm loudspeaker, a 4 ohm, or an 8 ohm or a 16 ohm loudspeaker, it's like specifying like 2 ohm loudspeaker would be equivalent to a 40-ton truck, heavy truck, heavy industrial machinery. A 4 ohm loudspeaker would be equivalent to a very heavy van. An 8 ohm loudspeaker would be equivalent to an SUV, and a 16 ohm loudspeaker would be equivalent to a sports car. So, and the engine of these is your amplifier, and the amplifiers has a certain challenge to drive a loudspeaker, the same way as the car engine has a challenge to drive your car. And this impedance number tells us the exact same thing as the weight of a personal vehicle or a truck would tell us. The heavier the weight, the harder that engine has to work to propel this vehicle and control that vehicle. Same thing happening here, and that's why it's irrelevant that here at 2-3 kilohertz it climbs to 15 ohms, and down here it climbs to about 30 ohms, because there the engine can drive it without problems. It's not a heavy load. What will really hold down the amplifier is the impedance value, that 2.5 ohm there. That is the key. That's where the loudspeaker is harder to drive, and basically you have to put in an engine that has enough horsepowers, or as we call them in audio terms, watts, to drive that loudspeaker. So that's why this type of thing, what they did here, the honesty here was that when you read nowadays specified as 8 ohms with a minimum value of 3 ohms, this means that the minimum value of 3 ohms, that is the nominal value. Forget the 8 ohms. What I do here is that I call extreme bullcrap on that. 8 ohm with a 3 ohm dip specification. That's total BS. That's really lying in the eyes of the customers, because that's not 8 ohm dipping to 3 ohm. That is a 3 ohm loudspeaker dipping to 2.55 ohm, because if you read in the text, this loudspeaker dips to 2.55 ohms. And if I would get a calculator, and what I could do with that is to calculate the nominal impedance from the actual dip, then it would calculate that 2.55 divided by 0.8 equals 3.18. So it is a 3.18 ohms loudspeaker. And in the 80s, in the 90s, loudspeaker manufacturers used to be honest, and that's how they calculated the impedance figures, impedance numbers, that they took the value, divided it by 0.8, and that was the nominal impedance. And of course, most amplifiers at that time and even today have 4 ohm taps and 8 ohm taps, and the number, if it was closer to 4 ohm, they called it a 4 ohm loudspeaker, and if it was closer to 8 ohm, they called it an 8 ohm loudspeaker. But the God honest truth of this scenario is when you take the lower number and divided by 0.8. That's the honest nominal impedance of your loudspeaker, and that will define how hard it is to drive your loudspeaker. And it doesn't matter how high it climbs from there, because all that matters is the heaviest part of the load. And I'm now going to show you what a higher impedance loudspeaker looks like, because this is a 3 ohm loudspeaker. Now I'm going to show you how these numbers look like for a 16 ohm loudspeaker. So this is my voice of Lancelot's measurements. It looks a little bit different because I'm showing you the real data. So here, what John Atkinson uses for stereophile, he uses that V2 measurement system to take the measurements, but obviously this figure here, this graph, is not the output of DATS V2. This is going through some alterations. So I think it went through smoothing as well. And also DATS V2 is an older version. I'm using the version 3, more modern version, that can calculate, that can measure with higher resolution. So here you see like really nice curves, no sudden peaks there, just nice big curves. And when we go here with the DATS V3 and the original measurement, you see that it's much more rough, and you have some little bumps there, and you do not see these things on the stereophile curves because they are using an older system to measure that doesn't have that high resolution. And it seems that, I suspect that those figures also go through some maybe like a 6-octave smoothing or something like that. And when you use a smoothing for the octaves, then it will make some of these humps disappear, and the whole thing will look like artificially more smooth. So when you take a look at the raw measurement data, it will look much closer to this than what you see in the stereophile figures. So what's happening here is, let's look at the dips. So this is, how do we know that this is a 16 ohm loudspeaker? Let's look at the dips here. So here we have a valley down there in the base region. You see this is just under 20 hertz. That's at 18 hertz. This is going to be, if you have a tube amp, this is going to be its hardest point to work, because for tube amps, as the frequency drops, there is a much higher need for inductance. So this is where your output transformer is going to limit the output power. And this, if you have a tube amp, this will tell you the accurate difficulty or accurate load for the low frequency extension. And you see it will be different from the actual minimum of the loudspeaker, which is right here, and we see it's 13 ohms at 100 hertz. So it's a little over 13 ohms, like 13.26 ohms. So if we crunch the numbers, it turns out that divide this by 0.8, then it's about 16.4 ohms. So this is a true 16 ohm loudspeaker. And when we crunch here the second value, this gives us 18 ohms. So what this will tell us is that it's a 16 ohm loudspeaker, and even if you have a tube amplifier with an output transformer, you can still have very good output at the sub 20 hertz region, because the impedance there is very, very low. So basically a tube amp will love this loudspeaker down to this point, which is 13.8 hertz. That's where it reaches 20 ohms. So this is where the 16 ohm tap of your power amplifier, of your tube amplifier, it will start to have problems below this point. So down to 14 hertz, basically your amp is a happy camper if you have a good output transformer, even when you do not use feedback. So what else? As we see here, the lowest point is about 13 to 18 to 14 ohms, 13, 14 ohms, and let's see how high it climbs. It climbs up to about 147 ohms. Now going back here, we basically 3 ohms to about 30 ohms, and now there we have, instead of that, we have about 14 ohms to 150 ohms. And as you see, the valley and the peak are about the same. Here just multiply this number by 5 and you get these numbers. So the ratio between peak and valley is the same for the high ultra impedance speaker, the 16 ohm speaker, and the 3 ohm speaker. So this is about that many times higher, like 10 times higher than that. And it's regardless of it was a 3 ohm or it was a 16 ohm loudspeaker. And if we want to look at a thing which is different between these two loudspeakers, is that you see that the impedance rises quite high and quite steadily for the high frequencies. And why is that? Because here when we go back we have just a bloop and then it drops down. So this is because here we have the crossover, and that gives us that huge blip because we have to drive the crossover. That gives us this peak here, and then the tweeter takes over and the impedance drops. So basically your amplifier is dumping a lot of power again to produce the high frequencies. So this means that your power amp has a good hard workout doing the high frequencies above 10 kilohertz. But what's happening here? We have a compression driver, and to level the compression driver I use an impedance matching transformer and also a little additional resistance, and not parallel resistance, just series resistance, so that will make the 16 ohm compression driver seen as something that's around 100 ohms or higher. And so basically what's happening when you have a compression driver producing the high frequencies is that your amplifier needs to put out very little power for the high frequencies, because the compression driver needs only very little power to drive in case when you need to level it to your woofer. There are some compression drivers which are not as efficient as this, but my compression driver's efficiency is rather extreme. It's over 110 dB per watt meter, and it needs to be matched to the woofer's output in the cabinet, which is approximately around 102 dB per watt meter, and the leveling that is shown as the increase here. Of course, the increase here, this is the effect of the crossover. That's the low pass crossover starting to talk here, and that's here. This is where the high pass crossover is kicking in as well, but still that is quite smooth, and it does not, you see there's that, it's a little bit, it's a tiny blip here, and that's the high pass crossovers effect. So that's why the impedance starts mounting. However, the impedance of the compression driver is way higher than that. So sorry guys, now you see this is not just the answer to that original question. I'm giving you a little more information than that. Now we are kind of way past explaining why is it 2 ohms loudspeaker, or why is it a 16 ohm loudspeaker. And basically, coming back to the original question, what gives someone the right to name a loudspeaker as a specific ohms? The only thing that gives you the right to name it as something is the actual measurement. So whatever I measure here, I have to at the lowest range, I have to divide it by 0.8, and that will give me the load that this loudspeaker represents at its heaviest. And it doesn't matter if other regions are not so heavy, because you need an amplifier that is capable to handle the heaviest load. If it can handle the heaviest load, it can also handle a lighter load. However, the other way around, if your amplifier, let's come back to this one, if you buy an amplifier that's designed to handle an 8 ohm load as the manufacturer specifies here, that amplifier will literally crap out because you are tasking it with a 3 ohm loudspeaker. What you need here is to buy an amplifier that can drive a 3 ohm load, which has a 3 ohm impedance, 3 ohm output impedance. If you have your amplifier and it's not specified to drive drive a load of 3 amps or 2 amps, then forget about this loudspeaker giving you a weighty, powerful performance. It will sound wimpy because the amplifier cannot drive it. And it's not because it's a shitty or crappy amplifier, it's because the loudspeaker manufacturer company flat out lied to you what are the demands. So this is a same type of lie that when car manufacturer companies must declare what is the weight of the automobile they are telling you. And this type of obfuscation is the same difference as a manufacturer company is telling you that your car weighs 800 kilograms and in reality it weighs 10 tons. Now imagine what would be the effect if car manufacturer companies would start lying to us. Everyone would cry out. However, because in loudspeaker measurements no one really understands what's going on and no one keeps the companies honest, this type of flat out bull is just predominant. So what you need to do to get your bearings is to read the stereophile measurements, and when they read this part, minimum value of 3 ohms, because stereophile always gives you this minimum value, that's the impedance of the loudspeaker, and forget what the company specifies because most of them are just taking us for a ride. There are very few companies left who give us honest measurements, and you need to build up an experience basis. Which are those companies? And until then, just go to stereophile and read what's the minimum value and match your amplifier accordingly. So thank you guys for tuning in. I hope this was useful for everyone. Bye bye.